As a society, we rely on complex transportation networks in order to supply and transport important goods and materials. The same idea goes for the human body. Here, the circulatory systems form a complex transportation network, which allows movement of important materials, such as oxygen, around the body. This circulatory system has two divisions, the cardiovascular system and the lymphatic system. Now, let's get our blood flowing and focus on the cardiovascular system. The term cardiovascular can be broken down into cardio, meaning heart, and vascular, meaning blood vessels. So, the cardiovascular system consists of the heart and blood vessels, which together make up the blood transportation network of the body that carries nutrients, oxygen, and waste products to and from cells. The heart is a muscular organ that lies in the chest, and it pumps blood through the network of blood vessels in the body. It's composed of 4 chambers, a right and left atrium, as well as a right and left ventricle. Next are the blood vessels, which are tube-like structures that carry the blood being pumped by the heart. Arteries are the blood vessels that carry oxygen-rich blood away from the heart to supply the body with oxygen and nutrients. And veins carry carbon dioxide-rich blood and waste products from other parts of the body back into the heart. The blood running through these blood vessels also carries signaling molecules, called hormones, which allow for communication between organs and organ systems. Lastly, blood helps regulate body temperature. For example, when it's really cold outside, the blood vessels lying close to the skin constrict to reduce blood flow, saving the heat within the body. Now, there are 2 main networks, called the pulmonary and systemic circulation, that allow for blood circulation between the heart and the tissues in our body. In the pulmonary circulation, oxygen-depleted blood from body tissues runs from the right atrium to the right ventricle of the heart into the right and left pulmonary arteries, which carry the blood into the right and left lungs. This is the one exception where arteries carry oxygen-depleted blood. Here, the blood dumps carbon dioxide and receives fresh oxygen via gas exchange. Then, the blood runs back through 4 pulmonary veins to the left atrium, where it passes into the left ventricle. This is the one exception where veins carry oxygen-rich blood. Now, this is where the systemic circulation begins, pumping oxygen-rich blood into the body's largest artery, called the aorta. Along its course, the aorta gives off smaller arteries that gradually branch into smaller vessels called arterioles. Near the body tissues, these arterioles further divide into smaller vessels called capillaries. These capillaries form small networks called capillary beds in which blood flow is reduced. This reduction in blood flow allows the exchange of gases, nutrients, and waste products between the blood and tissues. Now, after this interchange of substances occurs, the capillaries regroup to form venules, which eventually drain into veins, and eventually into the 2 largest veins called the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava, which collect blood from the entire body and empty into the right atrium. And once more, the pulmonary circulation cycle restarts. Okay, now let's pause for a second and see if you can identify the chambers of the heart and the course of blood through the pulmonary and systemic circulations. Awesome. I'm going to assume you got them all right, so let's move on. Blood vessels often connect to each other, forming networks called anastomoses. These connections may be between an artery and a vein, called an arteriovenous anastomosis, between 2 arteries, called arterioarterial anastomosis, or between 2 veins, called a veno-venous anastomosis. Let's start with arteriovenous anastomosis, which allows direct flow of blood from the arterial to venous side of circulation without the intervention of a capillary bed. These types of connections occur in some skin regions between arterioles and venules where they serve to retain the body heat. Now, in some cases, the main blood vessel supplying a tissue can become blocked. Here, arterioarterial and veno-venous anastomoses provide possible detour routes, called collateral circulation, to ensure structures distal to the blockage receive ample blood supply. An example of collateral circulation is the circle of Willis in the brain. Sometimes, blood vessels may form an anastomosis, but it's ineffective or insufficient. These vessels are called functional terminal arteries. Here, an obstruction to the main artery supplying a tissue may possibly cause tissue death. An example of these arteries is the anterior spinal artery, which runs on the anterior aspect of the spinal cord. Also, blood vessels may not form anastomoses at all. These vessels are called true terminal arteries. An example of a true terminal artery is the central retinal artery of the eye. Since there is no anastomosis here, a blockage in the central retinal artery can cause blindness. Now, blood may also flow through two capillary beds before reaching the heart. The venous system connecting these two capillary beds is called a portal venous system. The most prominent example of this system is the hepatic portal venous system, which directs the nutrient-rich blood from the capillary beds of the digestive tract to the capillary beds of the liver. This allows the liver to filter the nutrients and other materials absorbed in the intestines for any toxins or harmful material before returning the blood to the heart. All right, as a quick recap, the cardiovascular system consists of the heart and the blood vessels. It regulates the body temperature and carries oxygen and nutrient-rich blood to all tissues, and removes carbon dioxide and waste products from them. This system is broken down into the pulmonary and systemic circulations. The pulmonary circulation is between the heart and the lungs, while the systemic circulation is between the heart and the rest of the body. Anastomoses are connections between blood vessels that serve as backup in case of an occlusion of an artery or vein. The arteriovenous anastomosis is a direct connection between the arterial and venous system, without the normal capillary bed in between. Lastly, portal venous systems are venous systems that link two capillary beds.
The smell of a morning coffee, the memory of last Christmas, and the pain of touching a hot surface. That's your nervous system at work. The nervous system allows each body system to communicate with each other and monitors internal and external changes to build a proper response that keeps us alive and kicking. Now, to make things a bit easier, the nervous system is structurally subdivided into two anatomical components, called the central nervous system, or CNS for short, which consists of the brain and the spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system, or PNS, which consists of the remainder of the nervous system outside of the CNS. Both the CNS and the PNS are made up of the functional units of the nervous system, called neurons, or nerve cells. These cells have many parts, with the main part being the cell body, which houses the nucleus of the cell. From the cell body arise two types of extensions: dendrites, which are short projections and may be numerous, and an axon, or nerve fiber, which is a single long extension that looks like a thread. Now, neurons are special because they're able to receive and send electrical impulses that allow for communication with other neurons, as well as with effector cells, like muscle cells. This process starts at the dendrites, which receive electrical signals from other neurons and convey it towards the cell body. Then, the cell body produces an electrical impulse and sends it through its own single axon. Many axons are covered with a layer of lipids and proteins that speed up the conduction of these impulses, called the myelin sheath. Now, the electrical impulse eventually reaches the distal parts of an axon, called the axon terminals. Here, an axon terminal can meet up with a dendrite of another neuron, and this contact site is called a synapse, which facilitates the communication between neurons. Now, there are a few types of neurons that are structurally different from one another. Neurons that have two or more dendrites and a single axon, like the one we just described, are called multipolar neurons. They're the most common type of neurons in the entire nervous system. For example, almost all motor neurons that control voluntary muscles in the body are multipolar neurons. Other types of neurons include bipolar and pseudo-unipolar neurons. Bipolar neurons are neurons with a cell body that has a single dendrite on one side and a single axon on the other side. These cells often act as sensory neurons, meaning that they relay sensory input to the central nervous system. An example would be the bipolar cells at the roof of the nasal cavity, which aid in the transmission of special sensory information, or our sense of smell, to the brain. Lastly are pseudo-unipolar neurons, which have a short, seemingly single, but actually double process that extends from the cell body. This common process divides into a peripheral process that extends from a sensory receptor to the cell body, and a central process that continues from the cell body towards the CNS. So an electrical impulse that is generated at a receptor, like touch or pain receptors in the skin, travels through the peripheral process and then continues into the CNS through its central process. All right, let's take a quick break to see if we can identify the different types of neurons. Great! Now, neurons are a bit like humans. They always need someone for support. And that's where neuroglia come in. Neuroglia, or glial cells, are the only other cell type found in the nervous system. And although there are several different types of neuroglia, they all function in some way to support and nourish neurons. These cells are smaller than neurons. But fun fact, there are 5 times as many glial cells as there are neurons in the body. All right, now let's switch gears and discuss the central nervous system, which consists of the brain and spinal cord. The main role of the CNS is to coordinate and integrate neuronal signals from the periphery, as well as perform higher-order functions like learning. Now, there is important terminology used when discussing different parts of the CNS. Let's start with talking about gray and white matter. Let's look at a coronal section of the brain. Note that the brain tissue has 2 different colored areas. Gray matter forms the outer portion of the brain and is the place where neuron cell bodies are found. This outer portion of the brain is often referred to as the cerebral cortex. The white matter, on the other hand, forms the inner portion of the brain and mainly consists of axons transmitting signals from one area to another. Remember that axons are typically covered with a myelin sheath that is made up of lipids. So this is what gives white matter its lighter appearance. Now, the spinal cord also has gray and white matter, but from a transverse section, we can see that their organization is the other way around. The gray matter lies in the center, and the white matter is found in the periphery. The gray matter of the spinal cord is shaped like a butterfly and has 2 major parts, an anterior part called the anterior horn, and a posterior part called the posterior horn. Also, a group of neuronal cell bodies may sometimes occupy a region surrounded by white matter, deep in the brain and brainstem. In this case, a group of neuron cell bodies in the CNS is called a nucleus. For example, in the brain surrounded by white matter are several distinct groups of cell bodies, called basal nuclei. Now, a bundle of axons within the CNS is called a tract, like the corticospinal tract, which consists of the axons of motor neurons extending from the cerebral cortex to the spinal cord. Now, the other division of the nervous system is the peripheral nervous system, which carries messages to and from the central nervous system, and consists of neuron cell bodies and axons, or nerve fibers, outside of the CNS. The components of the PNS are similar to the CNS, but the terminology used is slightly different. In the PNS, a group of cell bodies is called a ganglion. For example, the cell bodies of peripheral sensory neurons are located outside the spinal cord in the dorsal root ganglion. And a bundle of axons running together in the PNS is called a nerve. Now, there are two types of nerves in the peripheral nervous system. Nerves that arise from the spinal cord, called spinal nerves, and nerves that arise from the brain, called cranial nerves. Let's start first with cranial nerves, which are 12 pairs of nerves that exit the skull through different openings, or foramina. The cranial nerves then travel to mainly innervate structures of the head and neck. These nerves can be divided into 3 groups, depending on the type of information that they carry, as either sensory, motor, or mixed cranial nerves. Now remember, although the cranial nerves originate from the brain, which is part of the CNS, they are still considered to be part of the peripheral nervous system. The other type of nerves in the PNS are spinal nerves, which are nerves that arise directly from the spinal cord via 2 routes, called the ventral or anterior roots and dorsal or posterior roots. Now, the ventral or anterior roots consist of a number of efferent or motor fibers from the anterior horn of gray matter within the spinal cord. These fibers carry motor information from the CNS to the muscles of the body. The dorsal or posterior roots, on the other hand, consist of afferent or sensory fibers, which carry sensory information from the periphery to the posterior horn of gray matter in the spinal cord. You can remember these terms by the simple mnemonic: afferent fibers arrive and efferent fibers exit the spinal cord. Now, the ventral and dorsal nerve roots combine to form a mixed spinal nerve, which has both motor and sensory fibers. There are 31 spinal cord segments, with 31 pairs of spinal nerves arising from them. Starting superiorly, there are 8 pairs of cervical spinal nerves, 12 pairs of thoracic, 5 pairs in the lumbar region, another 5 pairs in the sacral region, and a single pair of coccygeal spinal nerves. The spinal cord segments and spinal nerves are identified by a letter and a number, indicating their region and level. For example, the 5th spinal nerve in the thoracic region will be abbreviated as the T5 spinal nerve. Now, each mixed spinal nerve almost immediately divides into 2 rami, a large anterior ramus and a small posterior ramus, that supply different parts of the body. Because both the anterior and posterior rami are branches of mixed spinal nerves, they carry both sensory and motor fibers. These rami, particularly the anterior rami, tend to join and rebranch in complex ways as they continue distally from the spinal cord, forming other nerves and networks of intersecting nerves called plexuses. For example, the anterior rami of spinal nerves C5 through T1 join to form a number of nerves that make up the brachial plexus, which gives branches that supply the muscles and skin of the upper limbs. All right, before we hit our last topic, pause the video and check which nerve structures you can recall. Great! Now, each spinal nerve innervates a particular area of the body. The specific muscles that each spinal nerve supplies with motor innervation is called a myotome. Each spinal nerve also receives sensory information from a specific area of the skin, which is called a dermatome. You can easily remember these terms since derma in Greek means skin and myo refers to muscles. Now, each dermatome and myotome is labeled with a letter and number that corresponds to its associated spinal nerve. For example, the skin around the umbilicus or belly button is innervated by the T10 spinal nerve, so we call this area the T10 dermatome. We often use these colorful dermatome maps to help visualize the specific regions that are supplied by each pair of spinal nerves. All right, as a quick recap, the nervous system is divided into the central nervous system, consisting of the brain and spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system, which comprises the rest of the nervous tissues. The nervous tissue has two types of cells: neurons that transmit signals, and supporting glial cells. In the central nervous system, groups of neuron cell bodies form nuclei that comprise the gray matter, while myelinated axons form tracts and comprise the white matter of the CNS. In the peripheral nervous system, a group of cell bodies is called a ganglion, and bundles of axons are called nerves. The PNS consists of 12 pairs of cranial nerves that arise from the brain, and 31 pairs of spinal nerves that arise directly from the spinal cord, with each nerve being formed by the union of ventral and dorsal roots. Efferent fibers leave the spinal cord from the anterior horn through the ventral root and provide motor innervation to muscles, while afferent fibers enter the posterior horn of the spinal cord through the dorsal root and provide sensory signals to the central nervous system. The short spinal nerves then branch into anterior and posterior rami. Dermatomes and myotomes are segments of the skin and underlying muscles that correspond to the areas innervated by each spinal nerve.
The lymphatic system may be the most underrated system of the human body. It protects the body from invaders, maintains the fluid level in the body, and absorbs dietary fat from the intestine. That's pretty amazing for a system that is really small, sometimes even microscopic. Now, the lymphatic system is composed of lymph, lymphocytes, lymphatic vessels and plexuses, lymph nodes, and other lymphoid organs. Lymphoid organs are the part of the lymphatic system that are directly involved in the immune system because they produce lymphocytes, as is the case with the thymus and bone marrow and house lymphocytes and other white blood cells that are ready to respond to pathogens, and as is also the case with lymph nodes, the spleen, and tonsils. But we are going to focus on the role of the lymphatic system in returning leaked fluid into the blood, so let's start by turning our attention to lymph and lymphatic vessels. Lymph is a clear or slightly yellow fluid that is transported through tubes similar to blood vessels called lymphatic vessels. Now, you may be wondering, where does this lymph come from? Well, it all starts at a network of tiny blood vessels called the capillary beds, where nutrient and gas exchange occurs. During this process, around 10% of this fluid is lost and ends up in the extracellular space, which is where the lymphatic system kicks in. This fluid will be taken up first by lymphatic capillaries, which are small, porous capillaries throughout the body that form lymphatic plexuses. Once this fluid enters the lymphatic capillaries, it's called lymph. Now, the small lymphatic capillaries merge to form the next part of the lymphatic system, called lymphatic vessels. Lymphatic vessels drain lymph through lymph nodes and eventually into lymphatic trunks, which drain large regions of the body, like the subclavian trunks that drain the upper limbs. Finally, lymphatic trunks converge to form two bigger channels called lymphatic ducts, specifically the right lymphatic duct and the thoracic duct. The right lymphatic duct collects the lymph from the right side of the head and neck, the right side of the chest, and the right upper limb. This duct drains its lymph into the right venous angle, which is the meeting point of the right internal jugular vein and the right subclavian vein. The thoracic duct, on the other hand, collects lymph from the rest of the body, which is the left side of the head and neck, the left side of the chest, the left upper limb, the abdomen, and both lower limbs. The thoracic duct begins as the cisterna chyli, which is a dilated sac where the lymphatic trunks carrying lymph from the lower limbs, abdominal viscera, and the pelvis converge. The thoracic duct travels through the thoracic cavity and eventually drains into the left venous angle. Now mixed with the blood, the contents of the lymph from the right lymphatic duct and the thoracic duct drain into the superior vena cava to reach the right atrium of the heart. Now, as lymph travels through lymphatic vessels, it encounters lymph nodes which filter the lymph and check to see if there are any foreign invaders the body needs to attack. Typically, lymph nodes lie close to each other, forming groups that may lie superficial or deep within the body. Let's start with the major lymph node groups in the upper body. First are the cervical lymph nodes, which lie on both sides of the neck, and the posterior mediastinal lymph nodes, which lie between the heart and the vertebral column. Next are the axillary lymph nodes, which are located in the axilla or armpit region. Further down the arm are the cubital lymph nodes, which lie in the cubital fossa on the anterior part of the elbow. The lower part of the body is also full of lymph node groups, which lie around the pelvis and lumbar areas. First are the lumbar lymph nodes, which are also called the caval or aortic nodes due to their proximity to the inferior vena cava and the abdominal aorta. Next are the iliac lymph nodes, which lie around the iliac blood vessels, and the superficial and deep inguinal lymph nodes, which lie around the groin. Finally, on the posterior aspect of the knees lie the superficial and deep popliteal lymph nodes. Before wrapping up, let's quickly remember the groups of lymph nodes on this image. All right, as a quick recap, the lymphatic system absorbs dietary fat from the intestine, protects the body from foreign invaders, and maintains extracellular fluid volume by returning excess tissue fluid to the blood. It consists of lymph, lymphocytes, lymphatic plexuses and vessels, lymph nodes, and other lymphoid organs. The lymphatic capillaries carry the lymph first through lymphatic plexuses to lymphatic vessels, then to lymphatic trunks, and finally drain into the venous system through the thoracic duct and the right lymphatic duct. The lymph nodes are scattered throughout the body and filter the lymph as it travels to the venous system.
The human body consists of hundreds of muscles, which come in all different shapes and sizes. Each muscle's particular structure allows it to perform a specific function. The muscles are attached to bones or other tissues to help us maintain position, perform movements, and even protect some organs. Okay, now muscle tissue is made up of contractile cells, often called muscle fibers. Muscle tissue can be grouped into three types: skeletal, cardiac, and smooth muscle. Skeletal muscles connect to the skeleton and other structures like the eyes to help with movement and stability of the body. These muscles are voluntary, meaning that we have active control of them to perform movements, like flexing your elbow. Cardiac muscle is the muscle tissue that makes up the walls of the heart. These muscles contract in a rhythmic way to pump blood to the whole body, and they are involuntary, meaning that we can't consciously control this type of muscle. Lastly is smooth muscle, which mainly lies in the walls of blood vessels and hollow organs. In blood vessels, smooth muscle helps contract the vessel walls to alter their diameter, which helps control blood flow. In hollow organs, smooth muscles perform rhythmic contractions called peristaltic contractions, which moves the contents of these organs in one direction, like food in the stomach or small intestine. Smooth muscle is also under involuntary control. Alright, now muscles come in a variety of shapes that help serve their specific functions. For example, a flat muscle has parallel fibers, and often has a flat, sheet-like tendon called an aponeurosis, as is the case for the external oblique muscle covering the abdomen. Next is a quadrate muscle, which describes a square muscle with 4 equal sides. An example of a quadrate muscle is the famous six-pack, anatomically called the rectus abdominis, which is a long, paired muscle that is divided into square-like portions by bands of connective tissue. Pennate muscles, on the other hand, have their fibers attaching obliquely to a tendon. These muscles can be grouped into unipennate, bipennate, or multipennate muscles depending on the relationship between the muscle fascicles and the tendon. Unipennate muscle fibers go in one direction and merge on one side of its tendon, like the extensor digitorum longus muscle in the leg. Bipennate muscles look more like a feather, having oblique fibers on both sides of the tendon, like the rectus femoris of the anterior thigh. And multipennate muscles have fascicles in different directions, attaching to a branched central tendon like the deltoid muscle, covering the shoulder. Next are fusiform muscles, which have a thick muscle belly that becomes tapered at both ends. An example of a fusiform muscle would be the biceps brachii. Speaking of biceps brachii, multi-headed or multi-bellied muscles have more than one head of attachment or more than one contractile belly. Both the biceps brachii and triceps brachii muscles have 2 and 3 fusiform heads respectively, and thus could also be referred to as multi-headed. Examples of multi-bellied muscles include the gastrocnemius muscle in the leg or the digastric muscle under the jaw, which both have 2 bellies. Next up are the convergent muscles, which are large muscles that arise from multiple points, but their fibers converge to insert into a single point. A good example is the pectoralis major muscle of the anterior chest wall. This muscle arises from the sternum, ribs, and clavicle, but inserts into a single spot on the humerus. Lastly are circular or sphincteral muscles, which are indeed shaped like a circle. Typically, these muscles surround a body opening, and their circular shape causes constriction of the opening during contraction. For example, the orbicularis oris surrounds the mouth, and when contracted, it helps constrict the oral opening, seen when puckering your lips when whistling. Okay, now let's take a deep breath and have a quick quiz. Can you identify the shapes of these muscles? Alright, now muscles attach to different body parts, including bones, cartilage, skin, or even other muscles. For example, many facial muscles attach to the skin of the face, which allows facial muscles to move the skin of the face to produce facial expressions like smiling. Now, every muscle arises from a point, called the origin, and inserts into a point, called the insertion. Typically, the origin is proximal, meaning that it is closer to the trunk of the body. Also, typically the origin does not move, meaning that it stays fixed when the muscle contracts. On the other hand, the insertion is distal, meaning that it is further away from the trunk. Also, the insertion point is movable, meaning that it gets pulled towards the origin to produce a movement. However, this is not always the case. Depending on which end of the muscle is fixed, some muscles can act in both directions, which means the proximal attachment is sometimes the movable end of the muscle. That's why some sources may prefer using the terms proximal and distal attachments instead of origin and insertion when describing the muscle's points of attachment. In some cases, the terms medial and lateral may be used instead to illustrate the proximity of the attachment to the midline of the body, medial meaning closer to the midline, and lateral meaning further away. Now, understanding the attachments of muscles is important in understanding the action a particular muscle may have. For example, the medial and lateral heads of the triceps brachii originate on the posterior aspect of the humerus and insert onto the olecranon process of the ulna, meaning they cross the elbow posteriorly. So, when they contract, the muscle bellies shorten to pull the insertion, or distal attachment, towards the origin, or proximal attachment, which in this case produces extension of the elbow joint. Now, let's talk about muscle function. The function of each muscle can be described using terms like prime mover or agonist, synergist, and antagonist. The prime mover, also called the agonist, is the muscle that provides the major force for producing a particular movement. This agonist often has a synergist, which is another muscle that helps the agonist directly or indirectly. Direct support means that the synergist performs the same movement as the agonist, but in a weaker manner. In indirect support, the synergist acts as a fixator, making sure that the proximal parts of a limb are fixed in place, which leaves the distal section free to move. In some cases, an agonist may have several synergists helping it out to make sure the right movement is executed. Now, like a good story, every agonist has an antagonist, which opposes the action of an agonist. Let's walk through an example. To perform flexion of the elbow joint, like when you do an arm curl at the gym, 3 arm muscles have to collaborate. The brachialis in the anterior arm, the biceps brachii muscle, which lies superficial to it, and the triceps brachii muscle in the posterior part of the arm. The brachialis is our agonist, our prime mover, since it shortens as it contracts and produces the majority of the force involved in flexing the forearm towards the arm. The biceps brachii is an important synergist, aiding significantly in this movement, and the triceps brachii on the posterior arm is the antagonist that helps coordinate and control the flexion by slowly relaxing as brachialis contracts. And finally, the deltoid is an example of a fixator as it stabilizes the humerus as brachialis contracts. Okay. Now let's finish up by talking about tendons, which are the tough, fibrous bands that connect muscles to bones. Their main function is to transmit the force produced by the muscle contraction into the bone they attach to, which allows for joint movement. A good example is the calcaneal, or Achilles tendon, a common tendon for both the gastrocnemius and soleus muscles at the back of the leg, inserting onto the calcaneus, or heel bone. Tendons can also play a positional role, meaning they can fix parts of the body in a certain position, like the fingers when writing. Alright, as a quick recap, muscles are the contractile tissues that help us perform movements and maintain body position. There is skeletal muscle, which are striated muscles attached to the skeleton, cardiac muscle, which is found in the heart, and smooth muscle, which is found in the walls of blood vessels and hollow organs. Skeletal muscles come in various sizes and shapes that correspond to their function. They work in a coordinated manner with the tendons that attach them to bones and with other neighboring muscles to perform particular movements and functions. What comes to your mind when you hear the word skeleton? Maybe last Halloween? While you may associate the skeletal system with the dead, it's actually an integral part of our living bodies. It is made up of 206 bones that provide form and support, protect the inner organs, and together with muscles, bones also help in performing different types of movements. Now, our skeleton can be divided into an axial and an appendicular skeleton. Let's start with the bones of the axial skeleton, which consists of the bones of the head, neck, and trunk. These bones include the skull or the cranium, a small bone in the neck called the hyoid bone, the vertebral column, and the ribs and sternum. The appendicular skeleton, on the other hand, consists of the bones of the upper and lower limbs. Now, bones of the axial and appendicular skeletons are further classified based on their shape as long, short, flat, sesamoid, and irregular bones. Let's start with long bones, which are tubular in shape, have a long axis, and usually 2 ends that articulate with other bones. An example is the humerus of the upper arm. Short bones, on the other hand, are cuboidal in shape, and examples include the carpal bones of the wrist. Next are flat bones, which are flat, thin, and possibly curved bones that usually protect internal organs. An example of flat bones are the cranial bones that protect the brain. Next are sesamoid bones, which are particularly unique because they lie within tendons. The largest sesamoid bone is the patella, or the kneecap, which is a triangular bone that covers the anterior side of the knee joint. Lastly are irregular bones, which are bones that don't fall into any of these categories, mainly because they have more complex shapes. Examples of irregular bones are the vertebrae which form the spine. Okay, now the surface of many bones is rather rough, with many bumps and depressions called bone markings. These bone markings allow bones to come in contact with other structures, like ligaments, tendons, fascia, and blood vessels. Now, there are 3 classes of bone markings. First, there are those that help in joining bones. Second, there are extensions and projections. And third, depressions and holes. Let's start with bone markings that form bony depressions and holes, which include notches, fossae, and foramina. A notch describes a dip or indentation in the margins of a bone, like the mandibular notch of the lower jaw. A fossa is a shallower depression, like the iliac fossa of the hip bone. Lastly is a foramen, which is an opening within a bone that gives passage to nerves and vessels. These foramina may be small, like the infraorbital foramen of the orbit, or quite big, like the obturator foramen of the hip bone. Next up are the bone markings that help in joining bones, which include the head, condyle, epicondyle, and facet. First is a head, which describes a large, round, articular end of a bone that fits into a depression or fossa of another bone, forming a joint. An example here is the head of the humerus, which fits into the glenoid fossa of the scapula, forming the shoulder joint. Next is a condyle, which describes a rounded, articular end, smaller than a head and usually occurring in pairs. Examples of condyles include the medial and lateral condyles of the femur, which articulate with the tibia, forming the knee joint. While we're at it, a small bump or eminence that lies on top of or beside a condyle is called an epicondyle. So it makes perfect sense for the femur to have 2 epicondyles, one above each condyle. These epicondyles don't articulate with other bones. Instead, they form attachment points for muscles. Finally is a facet, which is a smooth surface that is flat or slightly curved. Typically, a facet articulates with another flat surface or facet, forming a joint. For example, the ribs have many facets that join other facets of the vertebrae. Alright, now the next category on the list are bone extensions and projections, which include protuberances, spinous processes, spines, trochanters, tubercles, tuberosities, malleoli, lines, crests, and grooves. Let's start with a protuberance, which describes a protruding part of a bone. An example of a protuberance may be seen at the back of the skull, called the external occipital protuberance. Next is a spinous process, which is a spike-like projection, as seen at the back of each vertebra of the vertebral column. A spine, however, describes a sharp, narrow process. An example would be the spine of the scapula seen on the posterior aspect of the scapula. Next are trochanters, tubercles, tuberosities, and malleoli, which describe rounded, somewhat similar bumps. Trochanters are large, blunt elevations that lie on the sides of the upper end of the thigh bone, called the femur. These trochanters are called the greater and lesser trochanters and serve as attachment points for muscles and connective tissue of the lower limb. The humerus has similar but slightly smaller eminences called the greater and lesser tubercles of the humerus. Next is a tuberosity, which is a large, round elevation that also serves as an attachment point for muscles and connective tissue. An example of a tuberosity lies near the middle of the shaft of the humerus, called the deltoid tuberosity, where the deltoid muscle attaches. Finally is a malleolus, which is a rounded process. The popular examples would be the medial and lateral malleoli on each side of the ankle, which are projections of the distal tibia and fibula. Lastly are lines, crests, and grooves, which are 3 elongated projections. Let's start with a line, which is a linear process, like the one seen at the back of the femur called the linea aspera. A crest describes a raised or prominent ridge of bone. An example of a crest is the iliac crest, which lies at the top of the hip bone. Lastly is a groove, which describes a narrow, linear depression. Typically, a groove houses and protects a nerve or a blood vessel. For example, the radial groove of the humerus houses and protects the radial nerve and the deep artery of the arm. Okay, let's take a quick break and try to identify these structures. Okay, now let's get familiar with some terms related to long bones. First, the diaphysis describes the middle or shaft of a long bone, while the epiphysis describes its proximal and distal ends. Near the epiphysis, the diaphysis becomes a bit wider, forming the metaphysis. Finally, between the metaphysis and the epiphysis is a layer of cartilage called the epiphyseal plate, or growth plate, which allows these bones to keep growing during infancy, childhood, and early adulthood. Now let's talk about joints. Joints are the junction points between two or more bones. There are three categories of joints based on their structure: fibrous, cartilaginous, and synovial joints. Let's start with fibrous joints. These joints allow little or no movement because articulating bones are firmly connected by fibrous tissue. Now, based on the type and length of this fibrous tissue, fibrous joints may be further divided into three categories, called sutures, syndesmoses, and gomphoses. Sutures are the zipper-like joints between the bones of the skull where short fibers connect the interlocking bones. Syndesmoses connect bones through a fibrous membrane, like the interosseous membrane connecting the radius and ulna. And lastly, gomphoses, also called dentoalveolar syndesmoses, connect the roots of teeth to their bony sockets within the bones of the jaw. Next are cartilaginous joints, which typically allow for slight movements thanks to the cartilage tissue binding the bones together. Just like fibrous joints, the cartilaginous joints are grouped into subcategories depending on the type of cartilage involved. Primary cartilaginous joints, also known as synchondroses, are joined together by hyaline cartilage. These joints may be temporary, like the epiphyseal plate of the long bones, or permanent, like where the first rib is anchored to the manubrium by its costal cartilage. Secondary cartilaginous joints, or symphyses, on the other hand, are united by fibrocartilage, which is stronger but less flexible than hyaline cartilage. An example are the intervertebral discs that connect adjacent vertebrae. Finally, there are the synovial joints, which are the most common type of joint. In synovial joints, the articular surfaces of the bones are covered with hyaline cartilage, but they are separated by a fluid-filled joint cavity that is surrounded by a joint capsule. These features make synovial joints freely movable. There are 6 main types of synovial joints that are classified based on the structure of the articulating surfaces and the movement they permit. The 6 types include plane, hinge, pivot, saddle, condyloid, and ball and socket joints. More simply, we can divide them into uniaxial, biaxial, and multiaxial joints. Let's start with the uniaxial synovial joints. These are joints that move around a single axis, and they include the plane, hinge, and pivot joints. A plane joint describes a small joint between two flat bony surfaces, allowing for slight gliding or sliding movements. Typically, this type of joint is found between the clavicle and the acromion of the scapula, or between the wrist and ankle bones. A hinge joint looks and acts similarly to a door hinge, only allowing flexion and extension, like at the elbow joint between the humerus and forearm bones. Lastly, a pivot joint is made of a bony process that fits into another bone, allowing rotational movement around a single axis. An example of this joint is the atlantoaxial joint in the neck, which connects the atlas, the first vertebra of the spine, with the axis, which is the second vertebra. This joint allows for rotation of the head, like when you shake your head no. Up next are the 2 biaxial synovial joints, which allow movements to occur in 2 planes. These include the saddle and condyloid joints. The saddle joint consists of one convex surface fitting into another concave surface, resembling a person sitting on a horse's saddle. To visualize the movements of this joint, think about a horseback rider leaning back and forth for flexion and extension in the sagittal plane, or moving side to side for abduction and adduction in the frontal plane. Combining these movements also allows a certain level of circumduction. A good example is the joint of the thumb and the hand, called the carpometacarpal joint of the thumb. Move your thumb around and see for yourself. Next is the condyloid joint, which is similar to the saddle, but since its articulating surfaces are ellipsoid, its circumduction is much more limited and movement is usually greater in one axis than in the other. For example, let's take the metacarpophalangeal joints, which are the knuckle joints in the hand. These joints allow much more flexion and extension in the sagittal plane than abduction and adduction, or side-to-side movements, in the frontal plane. Lastly, there are multi-axial synovial joints, namely ball and socket joints, which allow a much further range of motion on multiple planes. This articulation consists of a head of one bone that nicely fits into a concavity or socket of another bone. This special articulation allows for the most movement out of all types of synovial joints. These movements include flexion, extension, adduction, and abduction, as well as medial and lateral rotation, which helps perform a wider range of circumduction. The hip joint is one of the most obvious examples for a ball and socket joint, where the round head of the femur articulates with the socket-like acetabulum of the hip bone. Okay, pause the video for as long as you need to see if you can classify each of these joints. Alright, now most joints are secured by strong fibrous bands of connective tissue called accessory ligaments. These ligaments strengthen the joint, stabilize it, and allow movement in only certain directions, basically holding the bones together and preventing their dislocation. Now, the ligaments associated with synovial joints can be classified based on their relationship to the fibrous joint capsule. There are capsular ligaments, also called intrinsic ligaments, that are really just thickenings of the joint capsule. For example, there are 3 capsular ligaments of the hip joint, including the iliofemoral ligament. Then there are extracapsular ligaments, also called extrinsic ligaments, which are separate from the joint capsule. For example, the coricoclavicular ligament anchors the clavicle to the scapula, but is separate from the acromioclavicular joint, where the clavicle articulates with the scapula. Finally, some joints have intracapsular ligaments, which are found deep to the joint capsule. For example, the anterior and posterior cruciate ligaments, or the ACL and PCL for short, are found within the knee joint, deep to the joint capsule. Joints, like any other tissue, require blood supply and innervation. Their arterial supply comes from articular arteries, which are branches from neighboring arteries that run in the joint capsule and anastomose, or form network connections with each other in order to reach all parts of the joint. The waste is then removed from the joint by the articular veins, which accompany the arteries. Joint innervation is also important for providing pain sensation, as well as proprioceptive signals that carry information about the movement and position of the body. The Hilton law states that the nerves that innervate the muscles surrounding or crossing a particular joint also innervate the joint itself and the skin surrounding it. Alright, as a quick recap, the human skeleton is made up of axial and appendicular bones. These same bones can be further classified based on their shape into long, short, flat, sesamoid, and irregular bones. The surface of bones have different markings, where they come in contact with other bones, blood vessels, and muscles. Joints are where bones articulate with each other, mainly to allow for movement, and they're classified into fibrous, cartilaginous, and synovial joints.
Whether you're playing volleyball with friends or just watching TV, your nervous system is always operating, making sure that the right organs function at the right time. The nervous system is structurally divided into 2 regions, called the central nervous system, or CNS, and the peripheral nervous system, or PNS. The peripheral nervous system can be further subdivided functionally into the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. Okay, let's start with the somatic nervous system, which describes a set of nerve fibers that control voluntary actions and convey sensory information from the skin, skeletal muscles, and joints. Somatic sensory fibers allow transmission of sensory information such as touch, pain, temperature, and proprioception. For example, somatic sensory fibers inform our CNS that our cup of coffee is too hot. Then, there are somatic motor fibers, which only innervate skeletal muscle and control voluntary actions of the body, like putting the coffee cup back on the table until it cools down. On the flip side, the autonomic nervous system controls the involuntary activities within the body. This system consists of visceral motor fibers that carry motor signals to smooth muscle, such as that found in the intestinal walls that allow for peristalsis to occur, as well as cardiac muscle and glandular tissue. We also have visceral sensory fibers, which are not typically defined as part of the autonomic nervous system, but they act in conjunction with the visceral motor fibers of the autonomic nervous system to control visceral function. Visceral sensory fibers travel with the visceral motor fibers, carrying sensory information from the viscera back to the CNS, where the visceral motor fibers will act in response to this sensory information. For example, they provide information about things such as the amount of oxygen in your blood, your arterial blood pressure, and the level of distension of your stomach after that big meal. This visceral sensory information is continuously regulating the activity of the visceral motor neurons of the autonomic nervous system, even while you sit here and watch this osmosis video. Now, there is also a unique set of sensory neurons we want to mention called special sensory fibers, which relay sensory information related to our special senses, such as smell, sight, taste, hearing, and balance, back to the CNS for interpretation. These fibers are not really classified as part of the somatic or autonomic nervous system. However, this information can modulate the activity of the somatic motor system, such as sending signals to skeletal muscles to turn your head in response to a sound. Or the autonomic nervous system, such as stimulating salivary glands in response to the smell of a freshly baked apple pie. Okay, now let's dive a bit more into the autonomic nervous system, or ANS. The ANS has two major subdivisions, the sympathetic nervous system, or SNS, and the parasympathetic nervous system, or PSNS. In addition, some classify the enteric nervous system, which is the intrinsic nervous system of the GI tract, as the third subdivision of the ANS. Now, let's start by discussing the SNS and PSNS, which, for the most part, have opposite effects in the body. Alright, now you've probably heard about the fight or flight response, which kicks in when one encounters an alarming situation, like seeing a bear on your hike, or before taking an exam. These situations activate the SNS, which prepares the body to respond to extreme or stressful situations. For example, the sympathetic nervous system will cause dilation of the pupils to improve vision, increased heart rate and blood pressure, and diversion of blood flow to the organs that will help with our fight or flight response, like skeletal muscles and the brain. On the flip side, organs that are not urgently needed to address the immediate stressful situation, like the kidneys and the gastrointestinal tract, are toned down. Okay, so once that bear is gone, or the exam is over, the parasympathetic nervous system kicks in to calm things down. It does so by decreasing your heart rate and blood pressure, increasing gut motility and digestive secretions, and by allowing blood to flow back to the organ systems that have been put on hold by the sympathetic nervous system, like the digestive system. These effects can be summarized as the body's rest and digest response. In a nutshell, you can think of these two divisions of the ANS like a seesaw, where they work together to balance each other out. Alright, as a quick break, let's see if you can answer the following questions. What are the main divisions of the peripheral nervous system? How about the different components of the autonomic nervous system? Okay, now let's discuss how information from the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems communicate through the central nervous system. Remember that a group of cell bodies in the central nervous system is called a nucleus, while a group of cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system is called a ganglion. Now, information that's conveyed in the autonomic nervous system passes from the CNS to its target organ through a two-neuron system. The first neuron sending a signal from the central nervous system is called a preganglionic or presynaptic neuron, and the second neuron that the preganglionic neuron synapses with is called a postganglionic or postsynaptic neuron. This second neuron is usually the effector neuron, meaning that it then directly synapses on the organ that it acts on. Now, there are other differences between the sympathetic or parasympathetic divisions of the ANS, based on the locations of the preganglionic neuron cell bodies and the route that the pre- and postganglionic neurons take to reach their effector organs. Let's start by talking about the neurons of the sympathetic nervous system. So, the cell bodies of the preganglionic neurons of the sympathetic division are located in the intermediolateral nuclei, which make up the lateral horns of the spinal cord's gray matter in the thoracolumbar spinal cord segments. Specifically, the preganglionic neurons arise from the T1 to L3 spinal cord segments. Now, let's follow the path of the preganglionic neurons more closely. So, from the intermediolateral nucleus, all of the preganglionic sympathetic fibers exit the spinal cord via the anterior root and enter the anterior rami of spinal nerves T1 to L3. Shortly after, these fibers leave the anterior rami to enter the sympathetic chain via the white rami communicantes. The sympathetic chain, or trunk, is a paired structure that runs parallel on either side of the spinal cord, and it resembles an interconnected string of pearls. The sympathetic chain consists of a bundle of nerve fibers and neuron cell bodies. The neuron cell bodies within the sympathetic chain form the paravertebral ganglia. Now, when the preganglionic fibers enter the sympathetic chain, there are 4 possible routes for these fibers to take to synapse with their postganglionic counterparts. First, a preganglionic fiber can enter and immediately synapse with the postganglionic cell body in the paravertebral ganglion at its respective vertebral level. Second, it can also pass through the paravertebral ganglion to ascend, or third, to descend the sympathetic chain before synapsing at a paravertebral ganglia at another vertebral level. Fourth, and finally, the preganglionic fibers can pass through the paravertebral ganglia without synapsing, and instead, they continue via splanchnic nerves to one of a number of prevertebral ganglia located anterior to the aorta and synapse there. These ganglia are named according to the main aortic branch that they're positioned near. The most superior are the paired celiac ganglia, found around the celiac trunk. Just below are one or more superior mesenteric ganglia, followed by the inferior mesenteric ganglion. For preganglionic fibers that synapse in one of the paravertebral ganglia, their respective postganglionic fibers then enter the gray rami communicantes and re-enter and travel along spinal nerves towards their target organs. If they just pass through the sympathetic chain without synapsing, they continue to the prevertebral ganglia, where they synapse on postganglionic fibers that innervate their target organs. Now, since the majority of the preganglionic fibers of the SNS synapse within the sympathetic chain, they're relatively short, while the postganglionic fibers are longer, traveling all of the way from the sympathetic chain to target organs all over the body. Alright, now let's move on to the parasympathetic nervous system. This division is known as the craniosacral division, since the cell bodies of the preganglionic neurons can be found in the gray matter of the brainstem and the sacral region of the spinal cord. The fibers arising from the brainstem leave the CNS through cranial nerves 3, 7, 9, and 10, and they innervate the head, as well as the organs found in the thorax and abdomen. The fibers arising from the sacral region of the spinal cord exit through spinal nerves S2 to S4 to innervate the pelvic viscera, and some abdominal structures as well. Now, in contrast to the sympathetic division, the parasympathetic preganglionic fibers are very long, because they typically synapse in ganglia that are much closer to the target organs, and this means the postganglionic fibers are quite short. Now, as we mentioned earlier, the enteric nervous system is sometimes considered a third subdivision of the autonomic nervous system. The enteric nervous system is a semi-autonomous system of neurons that make up the majority of 2 nerve plexuses within the wall of the GI tract. The submucosal, or Meissner's plexus, which is located within the submucosa, and the myenteric, or Auerbach's plexus, which is found between the circular and longitudinal layers of the muscularis externa. Given these locations, it makes sense that the submucosal plexus is involved with regulating local secretion and absorption of the nearby mucosa. On the other hand, the myenteric plexus, being located within the muscularis externa, is more involved in regulating the tone of the gut wall and the intensity of contractions. Now, the enteric nervous system is nicknamed the gut brain because these nerve plexuses can actually act completely on their own, as they possess receptors, sensory neurons, interneurons, and motor neurons, allowing for intrinsic reflexes to regulate GI function without any input from the CNS. For example, if stretch receptors in the stomach are activated by distension caused by a big meal, neurons within the wall of the stomach will directly activate smooth muscle fibers to increase motility, which will help digest that delicious veggie burger. Even though the enteric nervous system can act independently, though, it is still heavily influenced by the CNS, with the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous systems modulating the activity of the enteric nervous system. In the parasympathetic rest and digest response, the PSNS will interact with the enteric nervous system to mainly stimulate the activities of the digestive system, as opposed to the sympathetic fight or flight response, where the SNS will act to inhibit the activities of the digestive system. Okay, so before the recap, feel free to pause the video and see if you can identify the structures of the sympathetic nervous system. Alright, as a quick recap, the peripheral nervous system is functionally divided into the somatic nervous system, which consists of somatic sensory fibers as well as somatic motor fibers that control voluntary actions, and the autonomic nervous system, which is composed of fibers controlling involuntary functions of our body. The autonomic nervous system consists of visceral motor fibers that innervate smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands, and are accompanied by visceral sensory fibers that help regulate the function of the viscera. The autonomic nervous system is further divided into the sympathetic division in charge of the fight or flight response and its balancing counterpart, the parasympathetic division in charge of the rest and digest response. The preganglionic neurons of the sympathetic nervous system leave the CNS from the thoracic and lumbar spinal segments and synapse relatively close to the spine in paravertebral or prevertebral ganglia, meaning that their postganglionic neurons are quite long, running until they reach their target organs. The preganglionic neurons of the parasympathetic nervous system, on the other hand, leave the CNS from the brainstem and sacral spinal segments and synapse far away, closer to their target organs, meaning they typically consist of a long preganglionic neuron and a short postganglionic neuron. Finally, the enteric nervous system can also be considered part of the autonomic nervous system. It consists of the submucosal and myenteric plexuses within the wall of the GI tract. It can act independently of the CNS, but is also modulated by input from the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems.